All right. So I'm Gabrielle, and I want to thank you all for being here virtually. I never had the chance to participate into Data Fest before, so I'm really excited to be here for my first edition and talking with you today. I have a question with all of you. So I know most of you probably work in the field of data or science-related topics or journalism. And how do your friends react when you tell them what you do? Because when I started my career, I had a background in science, so my job was actually to write articles about health and human biology. And when I got to party and dinner and I would meet new people, I would tell them I work in scientific communication. And this is kind of the reaction I would get. People would just either like full on run away or simply nod and change the subject really quick and or straight me tell me I was probably a nerd and we didn't have to, talk about my job anymore. Later on in my career, I decided that I was kind of tired of words, and I really had a passion for the idea of sharing knowledge between from a scientific concept to a larger audience, and I was fascinated by visual, so I became a data visualization designer, and I came back to my friend at this dinner and told them I'm a data visualization designer. And this time, lucky for me, they didn't run away. And it started a conversation about what is data visualization and what was a data visualization designer. And the easier way for me to explain what I do in the everyday life is to kind of show them example of infographics, or people are pretty familiar with all this type of visual that you can see here, explaining medical illustration and app counting steps, and this is what always I creating very visually, easily understandable, and they were really familiar with this. But the conversation kept going, and maybe with more alcohol, my friends would become more honest with me and really tell me what they thought about my work. And they would tell me that infographics are boring, that maybe charts were sort of scary, or that they just didn't care so much for the information that it was carrying. And my friends are amazing, but they don't work in science-related field. A lot of them has stopped studying any type of science-related subject when they were 15 in high school. And some of them never went to university. And that's how I realized that even though this graphic had very informational and very legible, I had completely overestimated the interest that they would raise. And not only to my audience, they were not interested, but also they were almost scary. It would make them run away as if they had been traumatized by mathematical and charts in biology school, in biology classes. So I asked myself, what do really people notice, and what are they really interested in the daily life? People that maybe are not in the science-related field. And if you know me, I was born in the 90s, so that makes me what we call the millennial. And as any millennial is expected to do when you have a question, you turn to social media. So I went on the most famous platform, which is Twitter and Instagram, and I looked for the most popular post there. So the most liked and the most shared. And this is what I found. This is probably the most famous one, or some of the most famous example. Some of you probably have seen or liked or shared some of this posts. And if you look into the details, you can see that they all share something in common somewhat. They are not a graph to start with, and it's almost surprising because with the pandemic happening, we've been drowned with informational design and curve, and despite all that, none of those graphic is in this top 10. So unfortunately, we'll never be Instagram famous. But also, it's not a chart, and not only that, none of those images were computer generated. They were all photography of people, real people in real situation. And you're gonna tell me, those people are famous. Yes, obviously, of course. But those are not stage picture. Those are pictures that actually show them in normal environment. And it shows them as people having normal life and relatable life, even like therefore having a party at the beach or taking blurry selfies at a really massive party. And this millions of people seem to relate to those images, to somehow, it would make them see the world through those people's eyes, to see what they see, to feel what they feel, and to experience things the way they do. And this exact feeling of being able to put yourself into one's shoes is the definition of empathy. And this seems to be what created the success of these images. So I wonder, how do I take those information and elements and create database like those Instagram famous posts to create empathy? And I started again as a millennial with a subject on posting small posts and data visualization on Instagram. And my first discovery was that since my friends were so scared of charts, maybe my data visualization didn't have to be charts. So I applied the concept, this is not a pipe, and in this specific case, this is not a chart. And I tried to hide the chart within the visual so that it wouldn't right away be apparent that this was a data-driven design. So this is a visual that I created that talks about the US Census. So for those of you that are not American, every decade, the US government has to count its population to allow them to take funding decision and political representation. And it's very important because otherwise it changes the way they fund different communities. And this year, they're counting again, and it looks like the Black resident of America could be undercounted by almost 4% in this 2020 census. So if I had represented this with a normal graphic chart, it would just be like this classic pie chart with a very, very small 4%, which it looks so tiny comparing to the rest. But really, when you think about it, 4% of the Black population of America, that's almost 1.7 million of people. So I created a visual with the idea of showing first what was missing, and allowing me taking pixel off a picture, allow me to show that it was missing. And 4%, despite being so small, when you take it out of image, it actually completely changes the interpretation you can do of this image. And it shows the importance of it. Another example is this graph that is a bit more obviously a pie chart, but not completely. This is about the public charge rule. So the public charge rule is a new law that the Trump government just passed on marriage-based green card application. It sets new financial requirement. And now, unfortunately, more than half the people that were supposed to apply for green cards, marriage-based green card, don't fit the requirement anymore and won't be able to meet their loved ones in America. And this is a very sensitive subject. It's a partnership, it's couples, and if I had represented with a classic pie, it would have been really cold and not really display this information of relationship. So I chose to kind of embody the idea of relationship with this within the graph, with this rose cut and losing its petal, like a relationship dying because unfortunately people have to stay separated because of this new law. And you can see a trend here, which is using photography elements. And this kind of come from something else in my past. So my mother, she wears only one perfume. It's number 5 Chanel. And every time I cross someone in the street, I can't help myself but to remember of my mother every time. That's just the way it is. And it's a natural human reaction. And I think the same way, then smell, rings bell. The photography can be experienced as a visual reaction that comes as a response to particularly wrenching or exhilarating images, but also daily objects that remind us of our childhood or over life and personal experiences. So I started implementing more and more photography in my database. So here, as you can see, this is actually just a simple timeline about the ban on foie gras in California. So the ban has been on and off for more than a decade now. And instead of using a classic line with dots on the timeline, I decided to use the goose, which is the animal from which the foie gras is produced, to create more of a provoking and a striking illustration of what happened when the ban is lifted, meaning the gooses get her literally neck cut every time the ban is lifted to be able to produce foie gras. And another example can be also applied to use daily object that reminds people of the facts and figures of their life. Using daily object photography element can also enable the intimacy that would allow one to resonate with a particular subject. So this was a visual that I created for a campaign to support funding for Feeding America during the COVID-19 crisis. And the idea was to support families that are threatened by food insecurity. And in the US, 1 of 5 American children live below the poverty line and depends on free lunches at school. And instead of just using like those just 1 in 5 pie chart or those dots, I chose to represent this 1 in 5 children as a teddy bear falling below the poverty line, which allowed me to create a more impactful and maybe more emotional visual that people can relate to in an easier way. And among all those photography elements, it seems that the most powerful ones to break through preconception and maybe create compassion could be portraits. So I bet right now you're all looking at the man hanging from this point over there. And that's because the studies have shown that the eye gaze and in general human bodies and shape cannot be ignored by other human being. And in the study, despite being told that gaze and human figures were to be ignored because they were distractive and irrelevant for the tasks they had to do, participants in the study couldn't help themselves but to orient their attention towards human faces. And this is a well-known fact in marketing fields, and it is used and even, I would say, overused in marketing, but has yet to be explored within the realm of visualization. So I started implementing more to utilize those portraits into my visual exploration to add another layer of reality. And when it comes to very difficult and human subjects, like domestic violence or wealth disparities between communities, I think exposing faces creates a human connection between the human people that are behind the data, that are the source of this data, and the people looking at the data. Instead of blaming these individuals in a statistic, it could remind the reader of someone they know, maybe a son, maybe a daughter, maybe a grandmother, maybe the neighbor next door, or maybe the nice guy at the cashier at the store, or maybe even themselves. And it's especially true on the specific subject that I talk about communities, because a lot of data are about social injustices, for instance, and it's perfect. It seems very relevant to me to personify them because they are already misrepresented or underrepresented in general media visually. And so this is kind of what I had learned from this really small data visualization created from small data sets. And after a year of exploring and discovering this unconventional way to merge data and art and with compassion, I decided to take upon a new personal project that would be based off of a larger data set. And so, as you can see, I'm more particularly sensitive to gender inequality, and one of the issues that relates to gender inequality is also domestic violence. So I asked myself, how do I create empathy with data visualization on the subject of domestic violence? And the thing is with domestic violence is that it's not only very common, but sometimes it leads to tragedies. And that's what we call the femicide. And the femicide is a sex-based hate crime. And it's broadly defined as the intentional killing of a woman or a girl on account of her gender. And in France, in 2019, in my home country, 151 women were murdered by their partner or their ex-partner. And this is the subject I wanted to talk to you about today. There was no national database. I had to kind of Google it and find a data set that was available. And unfortunately, the government doesn't have those data except really large statistic. But I was lucky enough to find that a dedicated collective of women in France tracks every femicide in the media and in police reports. They've been doing so since 2017. And every year, out of the data they found, they create a Google Maps that retraces every incident in France, and also that shows some information about each woman and who those victims were. So this is what I ended with. I scrapped all the data and I ended up with a few columns on this Excel sheet, like the way you start a normal data set. So I had, most of the time I had the name, but not always. I had obviously the location where they live, the date when they died, and sometimes how old they were when they died. And already out of this data set, I could draw some charts, some easy charts. For instance, I could create, I could generate the age distribution of those women. So you can see here, and it's an easy message to tell. Like domestic violence and femicide could affect anyone at any age. But also I could show the distribution of the incident and the murders throughout the year. And what I realized is that it actually happens way more often than you would think. And in my home country, every 3 days, a woman dies, killed by her partner or ex-partner. And those graphics are very informational. They're very important, and they're designed. I put gradient. They're maybe more interesting, but they show the big numbers, and they don't really pay justice to the human components of this really sensitive topic. And that's because, as Joseph Stalin said, the death of one man is a tragedy, but the death of million is a statistic. So I wonder, how can I get away from this statistic and show that those people, those women, were not just a dot on a chart. They were people that lived and had a happy life. And so I went back to my data set and I asked myself, what are the personal information that I already have? Well, I already had their name, which is a very personal information. It was given to you by your parents. Sometimes it indicates your origin and it has a meaning. And on top of that, I also had their age and sometimes where they lived. So I could already decided to, instead of creating just those charts and big numbers, to create portraits created out of the data set. So I displayed those information. So I'm showing you here 2 examples, which is Jackie and Celine. So I had the names and I had the age and the location. So I display here, but this doesn't tell you who someone is. This just tells you really information that you could find on any governmental form. So I asked myself, what makes you you? So you name, your age, your location, but also maybe your job. You spend 8 hours somewhere, maybe, or like me, you did a visualization designer, and it tells me something about you. And maybe you have a family. I think if I tell you I have 4 brothers and sisters, you might have a better idea of my childhood, busy childhood. And also, what are your passion? I used to horse ride when I was younger, and now I do this weird thing called slacklining. And maybe also your character defines you. So I'm really outspoken, but I can be shy. And I think this gives you in general a better idea of identity and who someone is who. But there was no data set for this. There was no description in my Excel sheet for that. There was only quantitative information. So I went back and looked for every single woman if I could find more information about the quality of their life and who they actually were. And that's what you find when you actually look just online. You can actually find a lot of personal information of people. And because there was, especially since those people died, they had families and they left testimonials on Facebook, their certificate with, they raised funds for the funeral, and they talked about who they were online. And also the local news media had interviewed friends, family, neighbors, and those people would give information about who those women were. So I went back and then I could finally add more information about who those women were in life, and more information, little bits and pieces of information that draws you and create portraits that you can actually relate to. For instance, Jackie had 2 sons and they were both adults. And Jackie, as the name kind of indicates, was actually from England. She married a Frenchman, but she was originally from England. And Celine didn't have any children, but Celine was a police officer, and she was apparently really appreciated by her colleagues. But more than that, I could get even more qualitative information. The interview and testimonial from the family will allow me to put more adjective on who those women were. And for instance, Jackie was very elegant. Apparently she wore a lot of dresses and flower dresses, and she was very charming. And Celine, on her side, was very cheerful, and her mom said that she was an absolute ray of sunlight. And finally, I can add even more, which is like what they were doing outside of their job and in their daily life, what they like to do during the weekend, which is for Jackie, singing in the choir, and for Celine, she apparently really liked to party and used to drink a little too much. And once I collected all those data all together, I had massive Excel file, really. And so I decided to create a more interactive experience. Instead of having I usually tend to do infographic that are just traditional static pages. And in this specific case, I want the people, the reader, to be able to relate to every single one of those women. So I created this project with a long, very long page. And it is on purpose because I think that if I had displayed in just a static information, you would think that 151 women are really not much when you think about it. Comparing to the 70 millions of citizens in France, really 151 women is not that bad. But if you get to actually know them and see them as human beings behind the data, well, suddenly maybe you'll be more aware. And especially right now with COVID-19, domestic violence has been increasing a lot because of the quarantine. And I think maybe looking at those women and taking the time to discover who they are would make you relate to them in a better way, in a more careful way. And maybe you'll think about your daughter, your sister, and make sure that everybody around you is safe. And so I just want to conclude by saying that I think this year and the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need for more compassion between individuals. At least for me, I've heard that there's a strong rhetoric that we are all in this together and the virus affects everyone. And it's true, but really it's not the case. I think more than ever, actually, data and science shows us that we live in a world that's completely divided between social classes and over cultural differences. And so I think today I wanted to just introduce you to the way maybe I see the world, and maybe I've been trying to find, to merge data with art, to create compassion through this data visualization. And I hope that what I show you can inspire you maybe to explore your own original way to find data, to portray data visualization and use it as a tool to maybe raise awareness to subjects that are important to you, and also in general to just encourage us to practice more kindness toward each other. Thank you. I hope that was really interesting.